In a gleaming corporate tower, a meticulous financial analyst was about to discover the cost of getting too close to the truth. What started as routine year-end reconciliations took a shocking turn when she came face to face with systematic embezzlement. Patricia Evans wasn't your typical number cruncher. For 7 years, she had spent her life building an unshakable reputation for precision, known for catching errors that everyone else missed. When she encountered phantom companies bleeding millions from federal contracts, she had no idea she was walking into a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. Patricia made a calculated decision that would lead to the largest financial conspiracy case in federal history. What began as suspicion about her boss's irregular payments would become a dangerous game of corporate warfare. The company would never be the same after one woman refused to be silent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed their death song above my cubicle, casting everything in that particular shade of corporate beige that made even the coffee look expired. I'd been staring at the same Excel spreadsheet for 23 minutes. Watching numbers that didn't add up pretend they belonged together. The Q4 reconciliation reports were due tomorrow, and someone had been playing games with the data, not games. Surgery. James Carter's shadow fell across my monitor at exactly 3:47 p.m., punctual as a funeral director. He had that smile, the one that looked like it had been focus grouped and beta tested on a room full of venture capitalists. Patricia, how are we looking on those year-end numbers? I minimized the spreadsheet. Casual, like I hadn't been dissecting his handiwork for the better part of the afternoon. Coming along, James. Just double-checking some of the subsidiary allocations. Good. He perched on the edge of my desk, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixing with the stale recycled air. You know, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we streamlined some of our processes. Get rid of the redundancies. The way he said redundancies made my skin crawl, like he was talking about outdated software instead of people's livelihoods. The numbers don't lie, Patricia. Sometimes the most experienced people become the most comfortable. Complacent, even. I looked up at him then, meeting his eyes for exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, not too brief. Just enough to show I was listening without appearing defensive. I understand completely, but I did understand, more than he realized. The Meridian Consulting payments had been bothering me for weeks. 47 transactions, each one just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit flag. Meridian Consulting, which according to my research existed only as a P.O. box in Delaware and a website that looked like it had been built by a teenager with access to a stock photo library. James's smile widened. I knew you'd see it my way. We're a team, after all. After he walked away, trailing that cologne cloud behind him, I pulled up the reconciliation again. The Meridian payments weren't the only anomaly. There were the Phoenix Industries transfers, the Quantum Solutions retainers, the Apex development fees. All of them hovering just below the radar, all of them leading back to the same routing number, all of them approved by James Carter's digital signature. My phone buzzed, a text from Max Turner, the junior analyst who'd been shadowing me for the past 6 months. Hey Patricia, noticed some weird stuff in the Phoenix file. Can we talk? I deleted the message without responding. Max was good people. Earnest in that way that reminded me of myself 7 years ago when I first walked into this glass tower with my community college degree, and a head full of dreams about changing the world through proper financial oversight. Now I knew better. The world didn't change. It just got better at hiding its scars. At 6:15 p.m., after most of the office had cleared out, I made copies of everything. The Meridian files, the Phoenix records, the quantum documentation. I stored them in 3 different locations: my personal encrypted drive, a cloud storage account James didn't know existed, and a physical flash drive that I taped under my desk drawer. James was building something, a narrative, and I was starting to understand my role in his story. The mistakes had started small, a decimal point in the wrong place here, a transposed digit there, errors that looked like carelessness but felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. Each one had my digital signature, my employee ID, my approval timestamp. Each one created just enough confusion to muddy the waters around the real irregularities. By 7 p.m., the office was a tomb, just me and the security guard making his rounds, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. I stayed until 8:30, documenting everything, creating my own narrative. Because if James Carter thought he could make me the fall guy for his embezzlement scheme, he was about to learn that some people fight back. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. 47 floors of corporate ambition pressing down on my shoulder. In the lobby, the massive digital display showed our stock price, up 2-3% for the day. Shareholders were happy. The board was happy. James Carter was about to be very, very unhappy. I walked out into the city night, past the food trucks and the late commuters, past the protesters with their signs about corporate accountability. If they only knew. Tomorrow, I would start playing the game by James's rules, but I would be playing to win. The coffee machine in the break room sputtered like it was dying, which seemed appropriate given what I was about to do to my own reputation. I stood there at 7:23 a.m., watching brown liquid that barely qualified as coffee drip into my mug, and rehearsed being incompetent. It was harder than you'd think. 7 years of building a reputation for precision, for catching errors that other people missed, for being the analyst who actually read the footnotes. All of that was about to become collateral damage in my war against James Carter. Morning, Patricia. Max appeared beside me, looking like he'd slept in his car, which, knowing Max's student loan situation, he might have. You okay? You seemed distracted yesterday. I let my hand shake just enough to spill coffee on the counter. Sorry, just tired. Long nap. Max grabbed some paper towels, dabbing at the spill with the kind of earnest concern that made me feel like a monster. Want to grab lunch later? I found some more of those weird Phoenix transactions. Maybe. I walked away without cleaning up the rest of the coffee. The old Patricia would have stayed, would have made sure everything was spotless. The new Patricia, the one who was supposed to be falling apart, left messes behind. At my desk, I opened the Morrison account reconciliation and stared at it for exactly 12 minutes. Then I changed a formula. Not obviously wrong, just inefficient. The kind of mistake that would make James shake his head and wonder if I was losing my edge. It took him 47 minutes to notice. Patricia. His voice carried that particular tone of disappointed authority he'd probably practiced in business school. Could I see you for a moment? In his office, surrounded by his motivational posters and his MBA certificates, I sat in the chair that was positioned just slightly lower than his. Power Dynamics 101. James leaned back in his leather throne, fingers steepled, playing the part of the benevolent mentor. I'm concerned about the Morrison reconciliation. The efficiency ratios are, well, they're not up to your usual standards. I let my shoulders slump. I know, I've been having trouble focusing lately. Is everything all right at home? The question felt like a fishing expedition, like he was looking for ammunition, some personal crisis he could point to later when he needed to explain why Patricia Evans, once reliable, had become a liability. Just the usual stuff. Bills, you know. He nodded with practiced sympathy. We all go through rough patches, but the company depends on us to maintain our standards, especially during year-end. Can I count on you to get back on track? Of course. But as I walked back to my cubicle, I caught him watching me through his glass wall, studying me like I was a specimen in a lab, calculating when I'd become weak enough to destroy. By lunchtime, I'd made 3 more strategic errors. Nothing dramatic, just the slow erosion of competence. Max found me in the cafeteria, picking at a salad that tasted like disappointment. Patricia, I'm worried about you. I looked up at him. This kid, who still believed in justice and fairness, and the idea that hard work would be rewarded. I'm fine, Max. No, you left your computer unlocked this morning. You've been making calculation errors, and yesterday you seemed, he searched for the word, scattered. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this anymore. The lie tasted worse than the salad. Max's face went through a complicated series of expressions, settling on stubborn loyalty. That's bullshit. You're the best analyst in the department. If you're struggling, there's a reason. Sweet, naive Mac. If only he knew that the reason was sitting in a corner office 3 floors up, planning my professional execution. That afternoon, while James was in his marathon budget meeting, I accessed his calendar through the shared administrative system. Dinner with Leah Montgomery next Tuesday, golf with Bob Marshall on Thursday, lunch with someone from Meridian Consulting on Friday. Meridian Consulting, the phantom company that existed only in spreadsheets and bank transfers. I printed his calendar, folded it twice and put it in my purse. Then I opened the quarterly projections and changed another formula. This time, I made sure the error would cascade through the entire regional analysis. It would take James about 2 hours to find it. By then, I'd be gone for the day, leaving him to wonder if Patricia Evans was having a breakdown, or if she'd simply stopped caring. The truth was so much more dangerous than either option. At 5:30 p.m., I gathered my things with deliberate carelessness, leaving papers scattered across my desk in a way that would have horrified the old me. Max watched from his cubicle, concern radiating from him like heat from a fever. Patricia, wait, I turned back. He was standing now, looking younger than his 24 years. Whatever's going on, you don't have to handle it alone. The kindness in his voice almost broke my resolve, almost made me tell him everything. About James's scheme, about my counterattack, about how I was sacrificing my reputation to save my career. Instead, I smiled the kind of tired smile that suggested defeat. Thanks, Max, I'll be okay. But as I walked to the elevator, I heard him on the phone. Mom? Yeah, it's me. Listen, I think my mentor at work might be in trouble. Poor Max. He had no idea that his mentor was about to become the most dangerous person in the building. The Starbucks on 5th Street had the kind of aggressive air conditioning that made you grateful for bad coffee just to have something warm to hold. I sat in the corner booth at 6:47 a.m., laptop open, pretending to work on personal emails while actually monitoring our company's financial system through a VPN connection that Ethan Brooks had helped me establish. Ethan was 3 tables away, nursing what looked like his 4th espresso and typing code with the mechanical precision of someone who spoke fluent binary. We'd arranged this meeting through a series of encrypted messages that would have impressed the NS, not because we were paranoid, but because in corporate warfare, paranoia was just another word for preparation. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Package delivered. Perfect. Yesterday's mistake in the quarterly projections had been discovered at exactly 3:17 p.m., according to the system logs I was monitoring. James had called an emergency meeting with his inner circle, Leah Montgomery, the corporate counsel who'd probably sold her soul for a corner office, David Kim from accounting, who had the spine of overcooked pasta, and surprisingly, Ava Collins from HR didn't usually get involved in financial reconciliation issues unless someone was about to be fired or sued, or both. I'd spent the night in my apartment, surrounded by printouts and coffee cups, building a timeline of James's activity. The Meridian Consulting payments had started 18 months ago, small amounts that gradually increased as James tested the system's defenses. Phoenix Industries came next, then Quantum Solutions, then Apex Development. Each phantom company more sophisticated than the last, each one pulling money from different budget categories to avoid detection. But the beauty of financial forensics was that money always left a trail, and James Carter's trail led straight to a Cayman Islands bank account that he'd probably thought was invisible. My laptop chimed softly. New email from James. Patricia, please see me at 9 a.m. to discuss your recent work quality. We need to address some concerns. I smiled, closed the laptop, and walked over to Ethan's table. Morning, I said, sliding into the seat across from him. Morning. He didn't look up from his screen. Your friend made contact last night, 47 minutes, after you left the office. What kind of contact? The kind that suggests he's trying to access your workstation remotely. Looking for something specific. Ethan's fingers paused over the keyboard. Want to know what he was searching for? Tell me. Error logs. Specifically, a pattern analysis of your recent mistakes. He finally looked up, and his eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that made him valuable as an ally and terrifying as an enemy. He's documenting your decline, building a case, building a narrative. Ethan closed his laptop with a soft click. Question is, what narrative are you building? I pulled out a flash drive, the kind you could buy at any electronics store, completely unremarkable except for the data it contained. The one where James Carter goes to prison. Ethan pocketed the drive without looking at it. And the one where Patricia Evans doesn't. That's the plan. Plans change. He stood, shouldering his messenger bag. Be careful, Patricia. You're playing a game where the rules aren't written down, and the people who win are usually the ones willing to burn everything else to the ground. At 8:55 a.m., I walked into James's office, carrying a folder full of deliberately incomplete calculations, and wearing the expression of someone who'd given up trying. James was behind his desk, reading something on his monitor with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. Patricia, thank you for coming. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. We need to talk. I sat down, folder in my lap, and waited. I've been reviewing your work from the past 2 weeks, and I'm seeing some troubling patterns, calculation errors, missed deadlines, general disorganization. He leaned forward, his voice taking on that paternal tone that probably worked on people who hadn't spent months studying his methods. Is there something going on in your personal life that's affecting your performance? I don't think so, because the Patricia Evans I hired 7 years ago was meticulous, detail-oriented, the kind of analyst who caught errors that everyone else missed. He paused, letting the weight of disappointment settle between us. The work I'm seeing now, it's not up to our standard. I let my shoulders slump further. I'm sorry. I'll try to do better. I hope so. Because frankly, Patricia, this company can't afford employees who aren't performing at their best. Especially not in positions that require absolute precision. He opened a folder on his desk, one that was considerably thicker than mine. I've documented several instances of substandard work. If this pattern continues, we'll need to discuss more serious consequences. There it was, the threat wrapped in corporate speak, the promise of professional destruction, delivered with a smile. James Carter wasn't just setting me up for termination. He was creating a paper trail that would make me unemployable anywhere else in the industry. I understand. Good. He closed the folder with the finality of a coffin lid. Now I need you to focus on the Meridian account reconciliation today. It's particularly important, and I want your absolute best work. Meridian. Of course, he was going to have me review my own evidence, probably looking for any signs that I'd discovered his scheme. The irony was almost artistic. I'll get right on it. Patricia, he called as I reached the door. We're a team here. If you're struggling, I want to help, but I can only help people who are willing to help themselves. I nodded and walked back to my cubicle, where Max was waiting with a cup of coffee and an expression of barely contained panic. How did it go? Fine. I sat down and opened the Meridian file, letting him see the scope of the task. Hundreds of transactions, thousands of data points, all of them leading back to James Carter's carefully constructed web of fraud. Just need to focus more. Max lingered, clearly wanting to say something else. Finally, Patricia, if someone was trying to set you up, you'd tell me, right? I looked up at him, this earnest kid who still believed in justice and fairness, and the idea that good people always won in the end. Of course, but as I turned back to my computer, I caught James watching us through his office window. He was smiling, but it wasn't the patronizing smile he'd worn during our meeting. This was something else, something that looked almost like anticipation. James Carter thought he was hunting me. He had no idea that I'd already set the trap, and he was walking straight into it. The emergency meeting notification hit my inbox at 11:47 a.m., marked urgent with that particular shade of red that usually meant someone was about to lose their job. Conference Room C. All senior financial staff. Mandatory attendance. I stared at the screen for exactly 30 seconds, watching the cursor blink like a countdown timer. Then I saved my work. The deliberately flawed meridian reconciliation that I'd been crafting like a love letter to James's paranoia, and walked toward what felt like my own execution. Conference room C was the fishbowl, all glass walls and sterile white furniture, designed so that everyone could see the carnage from the corridor. James was already there, standing at the head of the table with a stack of papers that looked disturbingly familiar. Leah Montgomery sat to his right, her legal pad covered in notes that she kept covering with her hand whenever someone looked her way. David Kim from accounting had positioned himself as far from James as possible, which told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. Eva Collins arrived 30 seconds after me, her heels clicking against the floor with the precision of a metronome. She nodded at me, professional, neutral, but there was something in her eyes that looked almost like warning. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," James began, his voice carrying that particular tone of regret that executives used when they were about to destroy someone's life. "We have a serious situation that requires immediate attention." He lifted the first paper from his stack. My Morrison reconciliation, the one where I'd deliberately used an inefficient formula. Red ink covered the margins like arterial spray. "Over the past 2 weeks, we've discovered a pattern of errors in our financial reporting. Errors that could have serious implications for our year-end audit." His eyes found mine across the table. "Patricia, since most of these errors originated from your desk, perhaps you could explain what's been happening." The silence in the room was the kind that precedes avalanche. I could feel everyone's attention focusing on me like the convergence of laser beams, waiting to see if I would catch fire. "I've been having some difficulties with concentration lately," I said, letting my voice carry just enough tremor to suggest genuine distress. Personal issues." James repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "Patricia, you've been with this company for 7 years. In that time you've built a reputation for accuracy and attention to detail. These recent mistakes, they're completely out of character." Leah leaned forward, her voice taking on the silky tone that corporate lawyers used when they were building a legal case. "Patricia, have you been under any unusual stress? Financial pressures, perhaps? Health issues?" The question felt like a trap wrapped in concern. They were looking for a motive, some external pressure that would explain why a previously reliable employee might suddenly become careless or corrupt. Nothing out of the ordinary. "Because," Leah continued, consulting her notes, "if there were external factors affecting your judgment, it would be better to address them now rather than wait for the auditors to discover them." There it was, the suggestion, carefully phrased but unmistakable, that my mistakes might be more than accidental. They were building a narrative where Patricia Evans, financial analyst, had been compromised by outside forces and had begun making errors that conveniently benefited certain accounts. "I understand your concern," I said, "but I assure you, any mistakes I've made have been purely accidental." James nodded gravely. "I want to believe that, Patricia, but the pattern is concerning. And with our year-end audit approaching, we can't afford any uncertainty about the integrity of our financial data." David Kim finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," James said, his tone becoming more authoritative, "that we need to implement additional oversight for all financial reconciliations, double-checking every calculation, every formula, every data entry." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Effective immediately, Patricia. All of your work will need to be reviewed by a senior analyst before submission." The humiliation was supposed to sting, and it did, even though I knew it was theater. 7 years of building trust and credibility, reduced to supervised probation in front of my colleagues. "I understand." "Good." James shuffled his papers back into a neat stack. "Ava, I'll need you to document these procedural changes for HR purposes. And Leah, please prepare a summary of our findings for the executive committee." As the meeting broke up, I remained seated while the others filed out. Ava lingered, organizing her notes with unnecessary attention to detail, and when the room was finally empty except for us, she spoke without looking up. "Be careful, Patricia." "Excuse me?" James Carter didn't build his career on giving people second chances. "If he's keeping you around instead of firing you outright, it's because he needs you for something." She finally met my eyes. "The question is what?" "I'm not sure I understand." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Yes, you do. Ava stood, gathering her papers. You're smarter than you're pretending to be. The question is whether you're smart enough to survive whatever game you're playing. She walked out, leaving me alone in the glass fishbowl where everyone in the corridor could see me sitting at the scene of my professional execution. But instead of defeat, I felt something else entirely: anticipation. Because while James thought he was tightening the noose, he was actually giving me exactly what I needed. Double oversight meant that someone else would be reviewing my work, someone who would see the same patterns I'd been documenting, someone who might start asking the same questions I'd been asking. That someone was Max Turner. At 3:15 p.m., Max appeared at my cubicle with a stack of files and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "So," he said, sitting down at the empty desk beside mine, "I guess I'm your new babysitter." "I'm sorry about this, Max. I know it's not fair to you." "It's not about fair." He opened the first file, the Meridian reconciliation I'd been working on. "It's about figuring out what's really going on here." I watched as his eyes moved across the numbers, following the same trails I'd been following for weeks. Max was young, but he wasn't stupid, and unlike James Carter, he didn't have a vested interest in missing what was right in front of him. "Patricia," he said after 20 minutes of silence, "some of these transactions, they don't make sense." "What do you mean?" "Meridian Consulting. They're billing us for services that don't match anything in our project database. And he pulled out a calculator, his fingers moving with practiced speed. "They're always just under $10,000. Maybe they're small projects. 47 small projects in 18 months. All for exactly the same type of consulting work." Max looked up from the calculator, and all approved by the same person. He didn't say James's name, but he didn't need to. The pattern was becoming visible, even to someone who wasn't looking for it. "What should we do?" Max was quiet for a long moment, staring at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Finally, we do our job. We verify every transaction, check every approval, follow every trail." He met my eye. "And if we find something that doesn't belong, we report it. To who? To whoever will listen." As the afternoon wore on, I watched Max discover what I'd known for weeks. The phantom companies, the suspicious timing, the careful structuring of payments to avoid detection. But unlike me, Max didn't have to pretend to be surprised by what he was finding. His shock was genuine, his growing anger real. By 6 p.m., when most of the office had emptied out, Max had filled 3 pages with notes. Questions about Meridian, about Phoenix Industries, about the curious pattern of approvals that all led back to James Carter's digital signature. "Patricia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think someone's been stealing from the company. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime." Max looked around the empty office, making sure we were alone. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" I pretended to consider this, as if the answer hadn't been planned weeks in advance. "We need to be careful. If we're wrong, we're not wrong. The numbers don't lie." Sweet, naive Max. He still believed that truth was enough, that evidence would speak for itself, that justice would prevail if you just followed the rule. He had no idea that the rules were written by people like James Carter, people who understood that perception was more powerful than reality. But Max's innocence was exactly what I needed, because when this all came crashing down, when James Carter's empire of lies finally collapsed, it would be Max Turner who discovered the truth. Not Patricia Evans, the disgraced analyst with the suspicious pattern of error. Max Turner, the earnest junior analyst who'd stumbled onto the biggest fraud in the company's history while trying to help his mentor get back on track. "You're right," I said finally. "We need to document everything, build a case that can't be ignored, and then we take it to someone we can trust." "Oh," I looked across the empty office toward Ava Collins's corner office, where a light was still burning behind closed blinds. "I think I know someone." The parking garage at 2:17 a.m. was a cathedral of concrete and shadow, the kind of place where confessions were made and secrets were buried. I sat in my Honda Civic on level B3, engine off, watching the security camera sweep its mechanical arc across the empty space. Ethan had given me the blind spot coordinates, 37 seconds of invisibility every 2 minutes, perfect timing for planting evidence. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as I walked toward the row of executive parking space. James Carter's BMW sat under the fluorescent light like a shrine to automotive arrogance, all black leather and chrome pretension. I'd spent 3 days crafting what was inside the envelope. Bank statements that would suggest Patricia Evans had been skimming funds, transaction records that painted a picture of desperation and opportunity, email drafts that would imply blackmail, all of it carefully constructed fiction, but fiction that would look real enough to a paranoid mind already convinced of my guilt. I slipped the envelope under his windshield wiper and walked back to my car, counting steps in my head. 23 seconds. The camera would swing back in 14 seconds, but I was already in the shadow of the concrete pillar, invisible to both digital eyes and human judgment. Phase 1 complete. At 7:43 a.m., I sat at my desk reviewing Max's latest findings while drinking coffee that tasted like liquid regret. Max had spent the weekend building a comprehensive analysis of the phantom companies, complete with corporate filing searches and bank routing investigations. His work was meticulous, damning, and absolutely useless without someone in authority willing to act on it. Patricia, James's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. My office. Now. The envelope was on his desk, opened, its contents spread across the mahogany surface like tarot cards predicting doom. James sat behind his throne, face flushed with what might have been anger or excitement, studying the fabricated evidence with the intensity of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Sit down. I sat, making sure to glance at the papers with just the right mixture of confusion and concern. Is everything all right? Someone left this under my windshield last night. He held up one of the fake bank statements. Care to explain what it means? I leaned forward, squinting at the document with what I hoped looked like genuine bewilderment. I don't understand. What is that? Bank records, showing deposits to an account under your name. His voice was gaining momentum, feeding on its own indignation. Deposits that correspond exactly with discrepancies we've found in our quarterly reports. That's impossible. James stood, beginning the kind of theatrical pacing that executives learned in leadership seminars. Patricia, I've been watching you for weeks. The mistakes, the excuses, the gradual decline in your performance. I thought you were having personal problems, but he gestured at the papers. This suggests something much more serious. I let silence hang between us for exactly the right amount of time. Too short, and I'd seem defensive. Too long and I'd appear guilty. James, I swear to you, I have no idea what those documents are or where they came from. Then you won't mind if we bring in outside auditors to verify your accounts? Of course not, but even as I said it, I was calculating. External auditors would discover that the bank statements were forgeries, but that investigation would take time. Time during which James would be forced to explain why he'd been monitoring my work so closely, why he'd suspected me in the first place, why he'd felt the need to conduct his own investigation rather than going through proper channel. Time during which other people might start asking uncomfortable questions about phantom companies and suspicious transactions. Good. James returned to his chair, his anger cooling into something more dangerous: calculation. Because Patricia, I want to believe in your innocence. I really do. But the pattern of evidence is becoming difficult to ignore. What pattern? He opened a folder I hadn't noticed before, my personnel file, thick with 7 years of performance reviews and commendations. You've been an exemplary employee, trusted with sensitive financial data, given access to executive-level information, relied upon for critical year-end reconciliations. He paused, letting the weight of my former reputation settle between us. Which makes your recent behavior all the more concerning. I told you I've been having some personal difficulties. Have you? He leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of a therapist leading a patient toward revelation. Because, according to your HR file, you haven't taken any personal days this year. No sick leave, no family emergencies, no requests for time off to deal with difficulties. The observation was astute and dangerous. A truly struggling employee would have left some paper trail of their distress, but I'd been too focused on my performance as incompetent analyst to consider my performance as troubled person. I prefer to handle things privately. Admirable, but sometimes private solutions to public problems create complications. James closed the folder with deliberate precision. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Patricia, and I need you to give me a direct answer. Have you taken any money from this company beyond your authorized salary and benefits? No. Have you accepted any payments from vendors, consultants, or clients in exchange for favorable treatment of their accounts? No. Have you deliberately falsified any financial records or reports? The third question was the trap, because the answer was yes. I had deliberately falsified records, just not in the way James suspected. Every strategic error I'd planted, every calculated mistake, every piece of evidence I'd manufactured, all of it was falsification in service of a larger truth. No. James nodded slowly, as if my denials had confirmed something he'd already suspected. I hope you're telling the truth, Patricia, because if these allegations prove to be accurate, the consequences won't just be professional. Embezzlement is a felony. Wire fraud is a federal crime. The kind of thing that doesn't just end your career, it ends your freedom. I understand. Do you? He stood again, moving to the window that overlooked the city below. Because I'm trying to protect you here. If this investigation goes external, if the FBI gets involved, if prosecutors start looking at our books, he turned back to face me. Well, let's just say that cooperation tends to be rewarded, and obstruction tends to be punished. There it was, the offer wrapped in threat, the promise of mercy in exchange for confession. James Carter wasn't just trying to frame me, he was trying to get me to frame myself. I appreciate your concern, but I have nothing to confess. Then you won't mind wearing a wire. The suggestion hit me like ice water. Excuse me, if you're innocent, if this is all some elaborate mistake or misunderstanding, then you should be eager to help us get to the bottom of it. James returned to his desk, pulling out another folder. We've identified several vendors who might be involved in this scheme. Meridian Consulting, Phoenix Industries, Quantum Solutions. If you help us investigate them, if you're willing to cooperate in recording conversations with their representatives. You want me to entrap innocent people? I want you to help us catch the guilty ones. The beauty of his proposal was its seeming reasonableness. If I was innocent, I should be willing to help expose the real criminals. If I refused, it would suggest I had something to hide. But if I agreed, James would control the investigation. Control the narrative. Control the outcome. I need time to think about this. Of course. James's smile was all sympathy and understanding. Take the weekend. But Patricia, understand that time is a luxury we may not have much of. The longer this investigation continues, the more attention it's going to attract. And attention has a way of creating its own problems. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. James, can I ask you something? Of course. If you really suspected me of embezzlement, why didn't you go to the authorities immediately? Why handle this internally? For just a moment, his mask slipped. Something flashed across his face. Surprise, calculation, maybe even fear. Then the executive composure returned, smooth as expensive whiskey. 'Cause I believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Because I hoped there was another explanation. He paused, and because sometimes, Patricia, the best way to catch a thief is to let them think they haven't been caught. I nodded and walked out, but his words followed me back to my cubicle. James Carter thought he was the hunter in this scenario, patiently tracking his prey. He had no idea that every move he made, every threat he leveled, every piece of evidence he manufactured was being documented, recorded, and prepared for delivery to the one person who could end his career with a phone call. Max looked up as I approached my desk. How did it go? Interesting. I sat down and opened my laptop. Max, I need you to do something for me. What? Call Ava Collins. Tell her we need to meet tonight. And tell her, I paused. choosing my words carefully. Tell her that we have something she needs to see. About the phantom companies? About everything. The conference room felt different at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when you knew someone's career was about to end. Same fluorescent lights humming their death song. Same sterile white table reflecting the faces of corporate warriors preparing for battle. But the air itself seemed charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. James had called the meeting for 9 a.m. sharp. All senior staff. The email had said, financial irregularities investigation. But I'd arrived early to watch the players take their positions, to study the faces of people who thought they knew how this story would end. Leah Montgomery entered first, her legal pad already covered with notes and her expression suggesting she'd been up all night preparing for war. David Kim followed, looking like a man who'd received a terminal diagnosis but hadn't told his family yet. Ava Collins arrived exactly at 8:55, carrying a folder that she kept pressed against her chest like armor. And then came James, punctual as always, carrying what looked like a prosecutor's case file, and wearing the expression of a man about to deliver justice. "Thank you all for coming," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "We have some serious matters to discuss this morning." He opened his folder and pulled out the fabricated bank statements I'd planted under his windshield. Over the weekend, new evidence came to light regarding the financial irregularities we've been investigating. Evidence that suggests our suspicions about internal theft were correct. Max looked at me across the table, confusion clear in his eyes. This wasn't the script we'd discussed with Ava. This wasn't the careful, methodical presentation of evidence we'd planned. The documentation shows a pattern of embezzlement spanning approximately 18 months. James continued. Small amounts at first, gradually increasing as the perpetrator became more confident. Classic behavior for this type of white-collar crime. Leah leaned forward. "What's the total amount?" "Preliminary estimates suggest approximately $400,000. The number hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. $400,000, enough to destroy a career and a life, send someone to federal prison for years. And the perpetrator?" Ava's voice was carefully neutral. James's eyes found mine across the table. "Patricia Evans." If he was expecting shock, gasps, dramatic reactions, he was disappointed. Ava continued taking notes as if he'd announced the weather forecast. David Kim nodded slowly, like a man who'd suspected all along. Max, bless him, looked genuinely stunned. "That's impossible," Max said. "Patricia would never." "The evidence speaks for itself," James interrupted, sliding copies of the fabricated documents across the table. "Bank records showing deposits that correspond exactly with discrepancies in our quarterly reports. A pattern of increasingly erratic behavior. A gradual decline in work quality that perfectly matches the timeline of the thefts." I sat quietly, letting him build his case, watching as he constructed the narrative that was supposed to destroy me. Every detail was perfect. Every piece of evidence carefully crafted to support his conclusion. It was almost artistic in its completeness. "Patricia," James said, his voice taking on that tone of disappointed authority he'd perfected over years of corporate manipulation. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. David Kim, who couldn't quite look at me. Leah Montgomery, who was studying me like a specimen under a microscope. Max, whose face showed a complicated mixture of confusion and loyalty. Ava Collins, who was watching me with something that might have been anticipation. "I do, actually." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder, not the thin manila envelope James was expecting, but a thick document folder secured with rubber bands, and marked with an evidence tag that Ethan had helped me create. "What's that?" Leah's voice had lost its confident edge. "The real story." I opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Bank records, real ones this time, showing the true destination of the missing funds. Corporate filings for Meridian Consulting, Phoenix Industries, and Quantum Solutions, all of which traced back to a single Delaware shell company. Digital records of approval chains that led, inevitably, to James Carter's executive authorization codes. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady and clear, I'd like to present evidence of the largest embezzlement scheme in our company's history. $400,000, stolen over 18 months through a network of phantom consulting companies, all of it approved, authorized, and executed by our Senior Vice President of Operations, James Carter. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquake. James was staring at the documents spread across the table, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine searching for the right combination: confusion, anger, fear, calculation. "This is absurd," he finally managed. "Patricia, I don't know what kind of desperate game you're playing, but it's not a game." I pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead. "These are the findings of an independent forensic accounting firm that I hired 3 weeks ago. They've been tracking the money trail, following the digital signatures, analyzing the approval patterns." Max was leaning forward now, studying the documents with the intensity of a man watching his entire worldview rearrange itself. "These transactions, they're all the ones we flagged in our review. Every single one," I confirmed. "The phantom companies, the carefully structured payments, the timing designed to avoid automatic audit flags, all of it traceable to James Carter's administrative acts." Leah was reading over the forensic accountant's report, her legal training kicking in as she processed the implications. "Patricia, how long have you known about this?" "I suspected for months. I've known for certain for 3 weeks. And you didn't report it." "I could not without proof that would stand up in court, not when I realized that James was planning to frame me for his crimes." James finally found his voice. "This is character assassination, fabricated evidence designed to deflect attention from your own criminal activity. I pulled out the final document, the one that I'd been saving for this moment. "Because according to the security logs from our digital authorization system, you accessed my workstation remotely on 14 separate occasions over the past month. Always after hours, always when I wasn't in the office. Care to explain what you were looking for?" The document was Ethan's masterpiece, a detailed analysis of digital access patterns that painted a picture of systematic surveillance and evidence tampering. James's unauthorized access to my workstation, his searches through my files, his attempts to plant digital evidence that would support his fabricated narrative. "You've been building a case against me for weeks," I continued, "documenting my mistakes, creating a timeline of erratic behavior, preparing to present me as a desperate employee who'd turned to theft. The bank statements you showed us today, they're forgeries, well-crafted forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless." Ava looked up from her note. "How can you be certain?" "Because the account number on those statements belongs to a bank that doesn't exist." James created a fictional financial institution to support his fictional evidence. The room went quiet again as everyone processed this information. James was no longer the confident executive delivering justice. He was a man watching his carefully constructed lies collapse in real time. "The question now," I said, looking directly at James, "is whether we handle this internally or whether we involve the FBI." "FBI?" David Kim's voice cracked slightly. "Wire fraud is a federal crime. Embezzlement of this magnitude crosses state lines. When you consider the phantom companies incorporated in Delaware, and the funds transferred to offshore accounts, the federal authorities would be very interested in this case." James was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white with pressure. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually, I can." I reached into my purse one more time, pulling out a digital recorder, "including your confession from last Friday, when you tried to pressure me into wearing a wire to entrap innocent vendors." The recorder was a bluff. I hadn't actually recorded our conversation. But James didn't know that, and the possibility that his own words might be used against him was enough to drain the color from his face. Ava closed her notebook with deliberate precision. "James, I think it would be best if you cleared your schedule for the rest of the day. We're going to need to conduct a thorough review of these allegations." "You're taking her word over mine. I'm taking evidence over accusations." Ava's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, "and the evidence suggests that we have a serious problem that needs immediate attention." James looked around the table, searching for allies, for support, for someone who might still believe his version of events. But David Kim was studying the forensic accounting report, Max was reviewing the digital access logs, and Leah was taking notes that would probably become the foundation for termination proceedings. "This isn't over," James said, standing abruptly. "Yes," I replied quietly, "it is." As James walked out of the conference room, leaving his carefully prepared case file behind, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the pure, clean satisfaction of justice served. Not the corporate version of justice, where truth was negotiable and power determined outcome, but real justice. The kind where evidence mattered more than authority, where intelligence could triumph over manipulation. Max was the first to speak after James left. "Patricia, I can't believe you've been carrying this alone for weeks." I wasn't alone. I looked at Ava. I had help from people who understood that sometimes the system requires outside pressure to function correctly. Ava nodded slowly. "The question now is how we proceed. This is going to require coordination with law enforcement, cooperation with auditors, and probably congressional oversight given the scale of the fraud." "Whatever it takes," I said. James Carter thought he could destroy my career to cover his crimes. Instead, he's going to discover that some people fight back. The meeting continued for another hour, with Ava outlining the steps necessary to preserve evidence, protect whistleblowers, and coordinate with external authorities. But I was already thinking ahead, planning for the next phase of the battle. Because while this confrontation had ended James Carter's career, it had only just begun the process of rebuilding mine, and I was no longer the quiet, underestimated analyst who'd walked into this building 7 years ago with a community college degree and a head full of dreams. I was Patricia Evans, the woman who'd taken down one of the most sophisticated embezzlement schemes in corporate history, and that was a reputation worth building on. The emergency board meeting was called for 2 p.m., but by 11:30 a.m. the entire 40th floor buzzed with the kind of electric tension that preceded corporate execution. Word had leaked. It always did. And now the hallways hummed with whispered conversations and nervous energy as people tried to position themselves on the right side of history. I sat at my desk, fielding calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten my direct number, declining interviews with a politeness that felt surreal given the circumstances. The Wall Street Journal wanted an exclusive. Forbes was preparing a feature on corporate whistleblowing. Someone from CNN had left 3 voicemails asking if I'd appear on camera to discuss the courage it takes to expose corruption from within. Courage. As if what I'd done was heroic rather than necessary, noble rather than strategic. Patricia. Max appeared at my cubicle, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been awake for 36 hours straight. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "How's the mood out there?" Max glanced around the open office space, where clusters of employees were engaged in heated discussions. "Some people think you're a hero. Others think you're a snitch who destroyed a good man's career, and a few seem to think this whole thing is going to bring down the company. What do you think?" Max was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and studying my face like he was seeing me for the first time. "I think you saved the company, but I also think you might have saved yourself at the expense of everyone else." The observation stung because it contained a grain of truth. My war with James Carter had created collateral damage: uncertainty about the company's financial stability, questions about management oversight, the possibility of federal investigation that could paralyze operations for months. Max, if I'd stayed quiet, if I'd let James frame me for his crimes, how would that have helped anyone? It wouldn't have. That's not what I'm saying. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I'm saying that some battles, even when you win them, change you in ways you don't expect." Before I could respond, Ava Collins appeared at our cubicle. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past 4 hours, her usually perfect composure replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone carrying too much weight. "Patricia, I need to speak with you privately." We walked to her office in silence, past curious stares and whispered conversations. Ava closed the door and gestured for me to sit, but remained standing herself, pacing behind her desk like a caged animal. "The board has made some preliminary decisions," she began. "James has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. His access to company systems has been revoked, his corporate credit cards suspended, his office sealed. Good. Leah Montgomery has submitted her resignation, effective immediately. This was unexpected. Why? Because she was complicit, not in the embezzlement itself but in the cover-up. She knew about the phantom companies, knew about the irregular payments, and helped James structure them to avoid detection. Ava stopped pacing and looked directly at me. She's agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Smart move on her part. Maybe. But it creates a problem for you. How so? Ava pulled out a legal pad covered with notes in her precise handwriting. Leah's cooperation agreement includes her testimony about your methods, the deliberate errors you introduced into reports, the evidence you planted to manipulate James's behavior, the way you orchestrated this entire confrontation. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Are you saying I'm in legal trouble? I'm saying that when federal prosecutors look at this case, they're going to see a complex web of deception that includes both you and James. The fact that your deception was in service of exposing his crimes doesn't necessarily make it legal. But everything I did was to gather evidence of his embezzlement. Everything you did was to manipulate a federal investigation. You planted false evidence, deliberately corrupted financial records, and engaged in what prosecutors might characterize as conspiracy and fraud. Ava sat down heavily. Patricia, I believe you did the right thing, but the law doesn't always care about right and wrong. It cares about legal and illegal. The irony was bitter as overbrewed coffee. I'd spent months building a case against James Carter, only to discover that my methods might have made me a criminal in the eyes of the law. What does the company want from me? Complete cooperation with the investigation, full disclosure of your methods and timeline. And Ava hesitated. Your resignation. They want me to quit. They want you to resign with a full severance package, glowing references, and a non-disclosure agreement that protects both you and the company from further legal exposure. The offer was generous and terrifying in equal measure. Generous because it would provide financial security and professional protection. Terrifying because it would mean accepting the narrative that I was as much a problem as James Carter. And if I refuse, then you'll face the investigation without company support, which means legal bills that could bankrupt you, professional isolation that could destroy your career, and the possibility of federal charges that could land you in prison. I stared out Ava's window at the city below, watching traffic move through streets that seemed suddenly foreign. The people down there were living normal lives, dealing with normal problems, unaware that 40 floors above them a woman was deciding whether to accept exile or fight a war. She might not win. How long do I have to decide? The board meets again at 4 o'clock. They'd like an answer by then. 2 hours. 2 hours. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. Ava, can I ask you something? Of course. When you first suspected that something was wrong, that James might be involved in fraud, why didn't you act sooner? Ava was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the desk. Because I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of destroying an innocent man's career, afraid of the chaos that would follow if I was right. She looked up at me. I chose institutional stability over individual justice. You chose the opposite. And now we're all living with the consequences of our choices. I walked back to my desk through an office that felt like a minefield. Every conversation stopped when I passed. Every glance carried weight. Every interaction felt charged with significance I couldn't decode. The 47th floor had become a fishbowl, and I was the specimen everyone wanted to study. Max was waiting with another cup of coffee and a newspaper folded to show a headline that made my breath catch. Tech company insider exposes major embezzlement scheme. Below it, a smaller subheading, employees' controversial methods raise questions about corporate whistleblowing. They're calling you controversial already, Max said quietly. I haven't even been formally interviewed yet. Doesn't matter. The narrative is being written by people who weren't in that conference room, who don't understand what really happened. He paused. Patricia, whatever you decide about the company's offer, you need to understand that this story is bigger than just you and James now. It's become a symbol. A symbol of what? That depends on who's telling the story. At 3:47 p.m., I walked into Ava's office and closed the door behind me. "I've made my decision." Ava looked up from her computer, her face carefully neutral. "And I'm not resigning. Patricia, I need you to understand the risks. I understand them perfectly." I sat down across from her desk. "But I also understand that accepting your offer would validate the narrative that what I did was wrong, that exposing corruption is equivalent to committing fraud, that protecting the institution is more important than seeking justice. The federal investigation will find that I broke some rules to expose a much larger crime, that I used deceptive methods to gather evidence of genuine embezzlement, that I manipulated a situation to reveal the truth rather than hide it." I leaned forward. "I can live with those charges, Ava. What I can't live with is walking away and letting people believe that James Carter and I are morally equivalent." Ava closed her laptop with a soft click. "The board won't be happy. The board cared more about avoiding scandal than preventing fraud. Their happiness isn't my priority, and the legal risks are mine to take." Ava nodded slowly, making notes on her legal pad. "Then I'll inform the board of your decision, and Patricia, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. It's not the safe choice or the smart choice, but it's the right one. Sometimes that's all you have." As I walked back to my desk for what might be the last time, I realized that Max had been right. This battle had changed me, had transformed me from someone who followed rules into someone who made them, from someone who avoided conflict into someone who sought it out when justice was at stake. The old Patricia Evans would have taken the severance package and disappeared into obscurity. The new Patricia Evans was about to face federal investigators, hostile reporters, and a legal system that might not distinguish between means and ends. But she was also about to discover just how much power one person could wield when they refused to be silent. The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the board meeting that had officially terminated James Carter and launched the federal investigation. I was in my apartment, surrounded by legal documents and eating takeout Chinese food while preparing for the next day's deposition, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk, tomorrow, 6 a.m., Riverside Park, come alone. Aim Max." But why the cryptic message? Why the early hour and secluded location? And why did something about the tone make my skin crawl with the kind of premonition that usually preceded disaster? I arrived at Riverside Park at 5:52 a.m., when the morning mist still clung to the jogger's path, and the city felt like it belonged to ghosts. Max was sitting on a bench, overlooking the water, wearing a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He looked like someone trying to avoid recognition, which immediately put me on edge. "Max?" I approached carefully, scanning the area for other people. The park was mostly empty except for a few early runners and an elderly man feeding pigeons. "Patricia?" He didn't look at me when I sat down. "Thank you for coming. What's this about? Why all the secrecy?" Max was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the water with the intensity of someone trying to memorize the view. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "How well do you know me, Patricia?" The question felt like a trap. "I know you're a good analyst, a hard worker, someone I trust." Why? Because trust is a funny thing. We give it to people based on assumptions, on hope, on the belief that others share our values. He finally turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. "But sometimes we're wrong. Max, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with documents. "Because everything you think you know about the past 3 months is about to change." He handed me the envelope, and with trembling fingers I opened it. Inside were printed emails, bank records, phone logs, and photographs. But as I began to read, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The emails were between Max and James Carter, dating back 6 months, casual conversations about my work habits, my personal life, my financial situation, gradual escalation into detailed reports about my behavior, my access to sensitive documents, my potential vulnerabilities. "You were spying on me. I was doing my job." The bank records showed payments to Max from a consulting company I didn't recognize. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as the reports became more detailed. The final payment, dated just 1 week ago, was for $25,000. My job, Max continued, his voice eerily calm, was to monitor you, document your activities, and report back to James about any signs that you were getting too close to the truth. I felt like I was drowning in air. You've been working for James this entire time? Not for James, for the people James works for. Max pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. James Carter wasn't the mastermind behind the embezzlement scheme. Patricia, he was the front man, the fall guy, the expendable executive who would take the blame when the scheme inevitably collapsed. The world was reshaping itself around me, and none of the new geography made sense. What are you talking about? Ridian Consulting, Phoenix Industries, Quantum Solutions, they're all shells, but they don't lead back to James Carter, they lead back to the board of directors. Specifically to Bob Marshall and 3 other executives, who've been systematically looting the company for 2 years. I stared at him, trying to process information that felt like it was coming from an alternate universe. That's impossible. Is it? Think about it, Patricia. How did James know to target you specifically? How did he know exactly when to plant evidence? Exactly when to increase pressure? Exactly how to manipulate the situation to make you look guilty? Max leaned closer. He knew because I was feeding him information about your investigation, your timeline, your methods, your evidence. But you helped me gather that evidence. I helped you gather the evidence you were supposed to find. The evidence that would implicate James and protect the real architects of the scheme. The photographs in the envelope showed me meeting with Ethan Brooks, entering the forensic accounting firm, having coffee with sources I'd thought were confidential. Someone had been watching me for months, documenting my every move. Why are you telling me that? Max removed his sunglasses, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been guilt, or regret, or fear. Because the plan has changed. Because you've become too visible, too much of a symbol. The federal investigation is supposed to end with James Carter in prison, and everyone else protected. But your refusal to take the severance package, your insistence on fighting back, you've made yourself a problem. What kind of problem? The kind that requires a permanent solution. The words hung in the morning air like a death sentence. I looked around the park, suddenly aware of how isolated we were, how easy it would be for someone to disappear in the mist and early morning shadows. Max, are you threatening me? I'm warning you. He stood up, shouldering his messenger bag. The people behind this scheme have invested too much to let one idealistic analyst bring them down. They've spent 2 years building this operation, created dozens of shell companies, moved millions of dollars offshore. James Carter was always meant to be the fall guy, but you were supposed to be discredited and silenced, not turned into a martyr. So what happens now? Now you have you can disappear, take the money, leave the country, start over somewhere else with a new identity and enough cash to live comfortably for the rest of your life. He reached into his bag and pulled out a passport I didn't recognize, bearing my photograph but a name I'd never heard. Or you can continue fighting a war you can't win against people who don't follow the rules you believe in. I stared at the passport, at this alternate version of myself, who could walk away from everything and everyone I'd ever known. And if I choose to keep fighting, then you'll join James Carter in federal prison, or worse. Max put his sunglasses back on. They have evidence, Patricia. Real evidence this time, not the fabricated bank statements James used. Evidence of the financial fraud you actually committed while gathering your case against him. Evidence that will make you look like a co-conspirator rather than a whistleblower. You mean the strategic errors I planted. I mean the felonies you committed. Wire fraud, computer tampering, falsification of federal documents. 20 years minimum if they decide to prosecute. He paused. Unless you take the passport and disappear. The envelope felt heavier in my hands, weighted with the betrayal of someone I'd trusted, someone I'd mentored, someone I'd believed shared my sense of justice. But underneath the betrayal was something else. Fear. Not just for my own safety, but for the realization that I'd been playing a game whose rules I'd never understood. How long have you been working for them? Since before I was hired. The junior analyst position was created specifically for this assignment. Max checked his watch. You have 24 hours to decide, Patricia. After that, the choice will be made for you. He walked away into the morning mist, leaving me alone on a park bench, with a false passport and the ruins of everything I'd believed about the past 3 months. The pigeons were still circling the elderly man, who was scattering breadcrumbs with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I envied him. Time was the one thing I no longer had. The federal building at 7:43 a.m. was a monument to bureaucratic intimidation, all concrete and glass, and the kind of architectural authority that was designed to make visitors feel small. I walked through the metal detectors carrying nothing but my purse and the weight of a decision that had kept me awake for 36 hours straight. The passport Max had given me was in my apartment, tucked between the pages of a book I'd never open again. The money enough to disappear forever was in an offshore account I'd never access, because sometime during the long night of considering my options, I'd realized that running away wouldn't just mean abandoning my fight for justice, it would mean abandoning myself. Agent Sarah Chen met me in the lobby, her FBI credentials gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made me feel like I was being X-rayed. Ms. Evans, thank you for coming in voluntarily. Thank you for seeing me. We rode the elevator to the 14th floor in silence. The hallways were beige and institutional, lined with offices where federal agents were presumably dismantling other people's lives with the same methodical precision they would bring to mine. Agent Chen's office was small but organized with military efficiency. 2 chairs, 1 desk, a computer monitor, and a recording device that she activated with theatrical precision. This interview is being recorded. Do you understand your rights? I do. And you're choosing to proceed without an attorney? I am. Then let's begin. Agent Chen opened a file that was considerably thicker than I'd expected. Ms. Evans, we've been investigating the embezzlement scheme at your company for approximately 6 weeks. During that time, we've uncovered evidence of systematic fraud, totaling approximately The number hit me like a physical blow. 2.7 million, not the 400,000 that James had claimed, not even the estimates my forensic accountant had calculated. This was industrial-scale theft. However, Agent Chen continued, we've also uncovered evidence of your own criminal activities in the course of exposing this fraud. I understand. Do you? Because falsifying federal financial documents is a felony, Ms. Evans. Computer fraud is a felony. Conspiracy to manipulate a federal investigation is a felony. She leaned forward. Under normal circumstances, you'd be looking at 20 years in federal prison. Under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they? Agent Chen pulled out another file, this one marked with security classifications I couldn't read. Because your investigation didn't just uncover embezzlement, it uncovered something much larger. She opened the file and spread photographs across the desk. Corporate executives I recognized, bank officials I didn't, government contractors, whose names I'd seen in newspapers, all of them connected by lines drawn in red ink, creating a web that stretched far beyond my company. The shell companies you identified, Meridian, Phoenix, Quantum, they're not just stealing from your employer, they're part of a larger money laundering operation that's been moving funds from defense contracts, municipal bonds and federal grants into offshore accounts for the past 3 years. I stared at the photographs, trying to process the scope of what she was showing me. How much money? Approximately $47 million. The room seemed to shrink around me. What I'd thought was corporate embezzlement was actually financial terrorism, a systematic assault on public funds that made James Carter's theft look like petty larceny. Evans, you've inadvertently helped us expose one of the largest white-collar criminal enterprises we've investigated in the past decade. Agent Chen gathered the photographs back into the file. The question now is whether you're willing to help us finish the job. What would that involve? Complete cooperation, full disclosure of your methods and findings, and testimony that would help us prosecute not just James Carter but the 8 other individuals who've been orchestrating this operation, including Bob Marshall, especially Bob Marshall, the CEO, the man who'd built the company from the ground up, who'd been featured on magazine covers as a visionary leader, who'd testified before Congress about corporate responsibility. He was the spider at the center of this web. In exchange for my cooperation, immunity from prosecution for the methods you use to gather evidence, witness protection if necessary, and a consulting contract with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division that would pay considerably more than your current salary. The offer was everything I could have hoped for: vindication, protection, and a career that would allow me to continue fighting the kind of corruption I'd discovered. But there was something in Agent Chen's tone that suggested complications. "What aren't you telling me?" Agent Chen turned off the recording device and leaned back in her chair. "Off the record? Off the record. Your friend Max Turner contacted us 2 days ago. He's been feeding information to the criminal organization for 8 months. But he's also been feeding information to us for 6 weeks." The world tilted again. Max is a double agent. Max is a scared kid who got in over his head and decided to do the right thing when it mattered most. Agent Chen pulled out another file, this one with Max's photograph on the cover. He was recruited by Bob Marshall's people while he was still in college, offered a job and a signing bonus in exchange for monitoring potential threats to their operation. When you started getting close to the truth, they tasked him with managing you. Managing me? Feeding you information that would lead you to James Carter and away from the real architects of the scheme, making sure your investigation stayed focused on the symptoms rather than the disease. Agent Chen paused. But Max started having second thoughts when he realized the scope of what they were really doing. The money wasn't just being stolen, it was being funneled to offshore accounts that fund everything from human trafficking to terrorist organizations. So he came to us, and he's been wearing a wire for the past month, recording conversations with Bob Marshall and the other conspirators. Agent Chen smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "Evans, you may have thought you were fighting a corporate embezzlement case, but you've actually helped us expose a financial network that threatens national security. What happens to Max? Witness protection, new identity, federal protection for the rest of his life. Same offer we're making to you." I sat back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd stumbled into. What had started as suspicion about irregularities in quarterly reports had metastasized into a federal conspiracy case involving millions of dollars and threats to national security. "When do you need an answer?" "Now," Agent Chen reactivated the recording device. "Because in approximately 6 hours, we're executing search warrants on 47 locations, freezing 18 bank accounts, and arresting 12 individuals including Bob Marshall and James Carter. If you're going to be part of this operation, I need your formal agreement on record." I thought about the passport in my apartment, about the easy path that would have led to exile and anonymity. I thought about Max, who'd betrayed me and then redeemed himself by betraying the people who'd corrupted him. I thought about James Carter, who'd thought he was the predator in our relationship when he was actually just another victim of a larger system. And I thought about the woman who'd walked into this building an hour ago, carrying the weight of a decision that had seemed impossible. That woman had been afraid of federal prosecution, afraid of professional ruin, afraid of facing a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless. But the woman sitting in Agent Chen's office wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry, and anger, properly channeled, was the most powerful force in the world. "Agent Chen, I'd like to formally agree to cooperate with your investigation. On the record?" "On the record," she smiled again, broader this time. "Then let's go catch some criminals, Ms. Evans." As we walked toward the conference room where I would spend the next 8 hours providing testimony that would bring down a financial conspiracy, I realized that Max had been right about one thing. This battle had changed me, but not in the way he'd predicted. I was no longer Patricia Evans, the underestimated financial analyst who'd stumbled onto corruption by accident. I was Patricia Evans, the federal consultant who'd helped expose a criminal enterprise that threatened national security. And that was a reputation worth building. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, watching CNN's breaking news coverage on the mounted television screens. The chyron read, "Marshall Financial Conspiracy, Final Sentences Handed Down." Bob Marshall, 63 years old and formerly worth an estimated $400 million, had just been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. James Carter got 12 years. Leah Montgomery received 8 years, though her sentence was reduced for cooperation. The other conspirators, executives, lawyers, bank officials, and government contractors, received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. $47 million in stolen funds had been recovered and returned to their rightful owners, taxpayers, pension funds, and municipal governments that had been systematically robbed. The woman on the screen looked familiar, but it took me a moment to recognize her as myself. 6 months ago, Patricia Evans had been a frightened financial analyst trying to save her career. The woman testifying before Congress about corporate accountability looked like someone who belonged at that podium, someone whose voice carried the weight of authority earned through battle. Impressive work, Consultant Evans. I turned to find Agent Chen approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just closed the biggest case of her career. In the 6 months since our first meeting, she'd become something between a colleague and a friend, one of the few people who understood the cost of the choices I'd made. Thank you, Agent Chen, though I notice you're not calling me witness anymore. That's because witnesses testify and go home. Consultants stick around to help catch the next group of criminals. She handed me one of the coffee cups. Speaking of which, we have a new case that might interest you. Defense contractor in Virginia, suspicious payment patterns, phantom consulting companies. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar. Over the past 6 months, I'd learned that the Marshall conspiracy wasn't unique. Across the country, similar schemes were siphoning money from government contracts, municipal bonds, and federal grants. Each one used slightly different methods, but the pattern was always the same: create shell companies, structure payments to avoid detection, and ensure that any investigation would focus on expendable middle management rather than the architects. How much money this time? Preliminary estimates suggest about 15 million. Small potatoes compared to Marshall, but enough to fund a lot of very bad things. I sipped my coffee and watched the news coverage continue. The reporter was interviewing Max Turner, whose face had been digitally obscured for security reasons. He was explaining how corporate whistleblowing worked, how ordinary employees could recognize signs of fraud, how the system depended on people willing to speak up when they witnessed corruption. Max had testified under his real name during the Marshall trial, but federal marshals had relocated him to Oregon with a new identity immediately afterward. He was working as a financial analyst for a clean energy company, using his skills to help build something positive instead of concealing something destructive. We exchanged encrypted emails occasionally, careful communications about mundane topics that never referenced our shared past. What happened to forgiveness? I'd asked him during our final conversation before he disappeared into witness protection. Forgiveness is for people who can afford the luxury of moving on, he'd replied. Some mistakes follow you forever. I understood what he meant. The woman who'd walked into this building 6 months ago had believed in moral absolutes, in clear distinctions between right and wrong. The woman standing here now understood that justice was more complicated, that good people sometimes did terrible things for valid reasons, that survival often required choices that couldn't be neatly categorized as ethical or unethical. Agent Chen, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever wonder if we're making a difference? I mean, we catch one conspiracy and another one emerges. We put these people in prison and their associates just get more careful about hiding their tracks. Agent Chen was quiet for a moment, studying the television screen where financial experts were discussing the long-term implications of the Marshall case. You know what I think about when I have those doubts? What? The $47 million we recovered. That money was supposed to fund infrastructure projects in 12 different cities: schools, hospitals, roads, water treatment facilities, real things that help real people. She paused. Bob Marshall and his conspirators didn't just steal money. They stole the future from communities that desperately needed investment. And now those projects can move forward. Kids will attend schools that might not have been built. Families will have access to clean water that might have been contaminated. Emergency services will have equipment that might have been unavailable. Agent Chen smiled. That's the difference we're making, Patricia. One recovered dollar at a time. The elevator doors opened and Ava Collins stepped out, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent too many hours in legal deposition. She'd testified as a government witness in exchange for immunity, providing crucial insider testimony about how the conspiracy had operated within the company's power structure. Patricia, Sarah, Ava nodded to both of us. I saw the news coverage. Congratulations on closing the case. Thank you. How are things at the new company? After the Marshall conspiracy collapsed, our original employer had filed for bankruptcy protection, unable to survive the combination of legal costs, regulatory penalties, and destroyed reputation. Ava had found a position as head of compliance at a smaller tech firm, where she was implementing the kind of oversight systems that might have prevented the conspiracy if they'd existed earlier. Different. Better, I think. Ava paused. Patricia, I wanted to thank you again for not accepting the severance package. If you'd taken the money and disappeared, Marshall and his people might still be stealing from taxpayers, and James Carter might still be free. James Carter was always going to prison eventually. People like him don't stop until they're stopped. Ava shifted her briefcase to her other hand. But people like Bob Marshall, they're careful, patient, insulated by layers of plausible deniability. Without your investigation, without your refusal to stay quiet, they might have operated for years. After Ava left, Agent Chen and I walked toward the conference room where I would spend the afternoon reviewing evidence from the Virginia case. The work was familiar now, analyzing payment patterns, identifying shell companies, following money trails that were designed to confuse and misdirect. But familiarity didn't make it routine. Each case represented real harm to real people, real theft from public resources that were supposed to serve the common good. Agent Chen, one more question. Yeah, the woman who walked into this building 6 months ago, the one who was afraid of everything and understood nothing, do you think she would recognize the person I've become? Agent Chen stopped walking and looked at me with the kind of direct assessment that made her an effective federal agent. I think she'd be proud of you, and I think she'd be terrified of you. Why terrified? Because you've learned something that most people never understand, how much power one person can wield when they refuse to accept that corruption is inevitable. Agent Chen resumed walking. That kind of knowledge changes you. It makes you dangerous to people who depend on other people's complacency. Is that a good thing? Depends on which side you're on. As we entered the conference room where files from the Virginia case were waiting, I thought about the question I'd been avoiding for months. What came next? The consulting contract with the FBI was lucrative and meaningful, but it was also temporary. Eventually I would need to decide whether to build a permanent career fighting financial crime, or return to the private sector where my skills could be used for less noble but more financially rewarding purposes. But as I opened the first file and began analyzing the familiar patterns of corporate fraud, I realized the question had already been answered. The woman who'd discovered James Carter's embezzlement scheme had been motivated by self-preservation. The woman reviewing evidence of the Virginia conspiracy was motivated by something else entirely: the understanding that somewhere in Virginia, public money was being stolen from projects that would help people who couldn't defend themselves. I was no longer Patricia Evans, the financial analyst who'd stumbled onto corruption by accident. I was Patricia Evans, the federal consultant who'd chosen to make financial crime her life's work. And in a world where corruption seemed inevitable, where the powerful preyed on the powerless with systematic efficiency, that felt like the most important job in the world. Outside the conference room windows, the city continued its daily rhythm of commerce and ambition. Somewhere in those buildings, other conspiracies were being planned, other schemes were being executed, other people were making the choice between profit and principle. They had no idea that Patricia Evans was watching, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from